Now, before I introduce our second keynote speaker for today, Dr David Allison, I'd just like to play you something I brought up from a documentary series that ran on the ABC back in the very early 90s. In fact, I think it might have been 1990. I fished it out of our archive after we'd had a telecon the other day about it. And it's 4 minutes 20. It's the start of episode 1. It was a 3-part series. And I want you to just observe, if you will, the incredible skill and romanticism and storytelling capacities that the documentary makers have invested in this. It's called A Banker's Tale, and it's really the story. It's exactly what we were talking about earlier, is whether you get into the boardrooms, and it was the story of Westpac's dramas, Fairfax, and part 3 was called An Advisor's Tale. And to the best of my knowledge, it is the only documentary series I have ever seen which, I have seen overseas ones, that's not true. The BBC and PBS in America has done them. But for our purposes, to get right into this particular centre of power and lever pulling that affects so many people, I think documentary makers, in my experience, are not interested in this area at all. I think partly most of them are as poor as church mice, and they're not interested in they don't like. They're very suspicious of people in the CBDs. So this is very interesting, but what I just, given the way we've been discussing, some of it will be over the top as far as you're concerned. Listen to the way they've used music, listen to the language. I think they make the history of business very sexy and arresting, but you'll see what has to be done, in my opinion, to get it there. So let's listen to part 1 of A Banker's Tale. It's a bit wobbly too, just have to tolerate that.
Made their way to a Sydney ballroom to farewell the chief executive of the Westpac Bank. His company faced losses larger than any in the history of Australian commerce, and Frank Conroy had effectively been fired. Yet Conroy was a popular figure. Colleagues came for heartfelt goodbyes and suggested he'd been sacrificed for the follies of others. This man had joined the Westpac family from high school and risen through its ranks. The bank was his world, and no chief executive before him had been executed.
Well, I did say anyway, he felt that night was the end of the era. The next chief executive was going to come from outside the family.
He was the bank under challenge, facing almost the threat of extinction, and its only hope was Frank Conroy, who'd just been appointed, and here he was, emptied out.
Conroy was atoning for the failures of his bank, perhaps for the failures of a whole profession. His farewell was a wake. The mourners were for the most part fellow bankers who knew in their hearts that, regardless of publicity about entrepreneurs, bankers had driven the wild boom of the 1980s. It was the decade in which big business flamed into public view, incandescent, heroic, and in time distressing. Like every commercial frenzy in history, this boom relied upon available money. Speculators bought shares, skyscrapers, mines, oil wells, factories, with credit, with other people's money, the bank's money. Journalist Trevor Sykes wrote, "Never in Australian history has so much money been channeled by so many people incompetent to lend it into the hands of so many incompetent to manage it." The delirium was set off by deregulation. Once, the Reserve Bank invited bank chiefs over every month for tea and counselling. Now, they were on their own.
Diane had an extraordinarily comfortable, protected position. What a cosy, comfortable, uncompetitive, in international terms, situation I had.
It was all through the old bricks and mortar network, and it was probably the social experience to get down to the local bank and transact whatever business you wanted to transact down there. We were all on lending quotas, we had interest rate caps. It was a pretty straitjacket sort of an environment to work in.
It wasn't an environment in which you wanted necessarily to be thrown in the deep end. You could dog paddle, but you weren't a world-class freestyle swimmer at that stage.
You've got to give them a push in the deep end of the pool.
I just had to leave it there. I just think it's a fascinating little snapshot. It's incredibly arresting, I think you'll agree, and it's amazingly, it's majestic in its tone. It strikes a tone that you might say, oh, really? But it does go on, and of course that was 1988. Isn't that devastating? We went through another whole version of it 20 years on. But I just think it's a very interesting example, and there's 3 episodes up there of music that you'd never put normally with those pictures, but just this incredible imagination that went into making that story live. And I think covering some of the ground that we were talking about today, but boy, the amount of effort that went into making that have an impact. And I mean, I saw it all those years ago and I've never forgotten it because, as I said, it hasn't been repeated, which says something about my organisation and commissioning. I'm well aware of it, but I just thought that was a good conversation starter. And we might well discuss aspects of it that hit you in the eye later. But I am absolutely delighted now to segue to Dr David Allison, I'm delighted to say, is going to address us now. He was appointed Associate Director for Curatorial Affairs at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History in October 2009. A fabulous job, it seems to me. From 1995 through till 2009, he was chairman of the Division of Information Technology and Communications, and that included collections and exhibitions in communications, computing, maths, photography, printing, graphic arts, numismatics, and electricity. He helped create, he's got a wonderful array of exhibitions that he's curated, Powering a Generation project, and he does remain fascinated, I'm told, by the history of electrical power, though really the history of computing is something he's put a lot of his energies into. He's curated The Price of Freedom, Americans at War, September the 11th, 2001, Bearing Witness to History, Deep Blue, DigiLab, a digital imaging laboratory. Now you see how you make that interesting. It's a small mystery, but he can maybe explain it behind the lines. The Universal Product Code at 25, and the Information Age, People, Information and Technology. He's a Princeton man, from where he has a doctorate. He has a diploma in French language and cultural studies from the University of Bordeaux, and a Bachelor of Arts from St John's College. He's project director of American Enterprise. This is the really interesting part of his CV now, an exhibition about America's business heritage from the 1770s to today, and it opens in the spring of 2015. So I welcome now Dr. David Allison to address us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I hope we don't think that you wish you'd rather seen the rest of that documentary instead of hearing my talk, but I will be sharing with you some thoughts about this upcoming exhibition that we are developing at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History It is the first time we've tried to do a major exhibition of the history of business. And, you know, as we've started this project, we've really asked ourselves, why is that? And it has everything to do with the topic of this symposium that we're part of. Traditionally, we collected the history of technology and innovation. So we've often done exhibits like we did on information technology, on the Industrial Revolution, on topics like that. But the notion that we should really focus on business history is a new thought to us. And as we go through, I will share with you some of the thinking that we have and see how it relates to the issues that we have talked about here. Now, it's a great honor and privilege for me to be part of this symposium, and I appreciate the opportunity to come and learn more about Australia as part of my time here. And I must say, I've just been fascinated by what I've learned in preparation for this and in being here, and I've become really very impressed with your history and all the similarities and the connections between American history and Australian history. And I've learned, of course, that Australia and the continental United States are about the same size. And you know, you have a lot less people than we do at this point. So as I've seen the similarities of our histories, I've said, gee, you know, maybe we should get together somewhere. I mean, you're really positioned for the 21st century. You're there related to China, you know, a stronger relationship. You know, we're always looking for growing in the United States. Now, I'm not talking about, you know, taking Australia like we did Alaska and Hawaii and making you a new state. You know, it would certainly not be a hostile takeover. This would be a strategic alliance, and we'd have to change too. But I think there's something to be said. I mean, could this be the future, you know, of our relationship? That we become the business powerhouse of the world, the United States and Australia together. I mean, after all, we have a common heritage. We both began with the undesirables of Europe coming to our shores. You know, we had the indentured servants and the convicts that came to America, and when we declared independence, they said, where are we going to send them now? You know, and so they came to Australia. But I think we've gotten the last laugh of that story, and I think the people that began our nations and their interest in opportunity and developing themselves and the heritage that we don't have of aristocracy and class structure, but much more heritage of freedom, has a lot to do with our business heritage and why we've been so successful. And of course, we share a love of beer. I showed this to my son. He said, don't do that, Dad. They don't really drink Foster's in Australia. That's just export. And I said, well, we don't drink Budweiser in America either. So, but it does give me a chance to get some of my beer facts in front of you. So I'll tell this from an American perspective as part of our search for a common identity. Well, what is an American's idea of a balanced diet? That's a beer in both hands, right? And what did the American say when he went into the bar with a slab of asphalt under his arm? He said to the bartender, that's one beer for me and one for the road. And what are the Americans' famous last words? Hold my beer and watch this. And finally, how are beer and life alike? For best results, you need to chill. So that's sort of part of our heritage, and hopefully you're a little awake now after lunch. So we're really, more seriously, what are some of the similarities in our business heritage that we should think about? We both have strong immigrant populations. We both have English values and an economic system that came from that heritage. Some people would even say we have a common language, although sometimes I wonder about that when I've gone around these last couple of days. We have a democratic government and a capitalist economic system. These are really fundamental values that shape our business history. We both have, as nations, abundant natural resources that have fueled our economic development and our economic growth. We're both dependent on international trade throughout our history, born that way, developed that way, unlike many other nations. And so we're shaped by similar historical forces in many respects. Of course, I don't want to minimize the differences. There are many differences as well. But as we look for telling business history, we can think about some of the similarities in our societies as we look at that challenge. Now, you would think that business history would be fascinating to people, would be the thing that they really want to know about. There's no question that business is the foundation of our society. Our economic development is who we are. I mean, when people come to our country and your country, they come for economic opportunity. When you look at the founding of our nation, we talk about being politically free, but more people throughout history have come to America for economic opportunity and economic freedom and economic growth and economic opportunity than ever came for political freedom. I mean, we have a minority of people today that participate in our elections. So that really wasn't the driver that sometimes we're told in our history classes. Because I think economic history is far more influential than either political or military history in determining who we are as a people and who we are as a nation. It affects every person. It affects their class, it affects their career choices, it affects where they choose to live, it affects their lifestyles. It really is the fundamental shaper of who they are as individuals and how they build communities together. But there are a lot of challenges, as we've talked about. You know, this has not been a big museum topic. Think of the best 5 economic history exhibitions that you've seen. You know? Now, if I ask you what are the top 5 art exhibits that you've seen, you could just, oh, you know, that's easy. I love this and I love this. But, you know, it's just not been something that's been at the top of the list. It's seen as technical and uninspiring and boring. I mean, think again about the famous business figures that you know. You know, again, sports figures, oh, I've got that list, you know. Artists, politicians, they're celebrities in our society, but our business figures are not. And it's not even taught in our schools as a major element of history compared to political or military or social history. So those are some of the challenges that we face. And as we look at exhibiting this topic, again, there's another set of challenges. What are the themes that you're going to choose? Are you going to deal with the rise and fall of the stock market or economic booms and busts? Are you going to deal with the development of business organization and structure like Chandler does in his books? What are the themes? What is the organizational strategy of the exhibition? How would you choose objects and graphics to tell your story in a compelling way? There are limited precedents to look at. Again, you can't say, well, they did it great over here in this. Victoria and Albert did a terrific exhibit. It's just hard to find something that we can look at. And one of the real challenges is what is the emotional character of an exhibit about business history? How can we get people feeling as well as reading and seeing? So we're trying to solve those challenges. Now, whether we'll succeed or not, you'll see in 2015. But we really think we're striving to do what we're calling a new business history, a different approach to business history than what you've traditionally known about. So it's not just the story of producers and business people. It can't just be that story. We're also trying to include the story of workers and consumers and the marketplace. I mean, how often have you told the story of consumption in the story of business? And yet all of us are consumers. Not all of us are business people. Not all of us are part of that society. Yes, we're all part of economic life, but much of that economic life is the consumption of business products. How can we make that part of the story? It's not just a story of business development and financing. It can't just be that to get the audiences that we want. It's going to include the products, the trading, the advertising, the marketing, consuming and reusing of business products. And finally, it's not just the story of business as a separate historical sector of our society, because we need to integrate that and tell the story in national context, social setting, cultural values. We were beginning to talk about that just before lunch, about how we tell the story of race and ethnicity in the story of business, of how we tell the story of how business shapes national character, how it shapes national government. So that's what we're striving to do. And now I'm going to tell you a little bit about our museum and how we're trying to do that in our context. We're part of the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian is 19 different museums and research centers. That's our building. If you know the mall in Washington, that's the Washington Monument. And the Smithsonian, many of the Smithsonian museums run along the mall in Washington. What we call the Big Three, the Air and Space Museum is there, the Natural History Museum is there, and our museum, that's Natural History. Air and Space is down there. So some of these buildings are not Smithsonian, but most people, when they think about the Smithsonian, they think about the museums that line the National Mall. And they think of us as a museum, even though we do a lot of research as well. This is our particular building. We were built in 1964. We're about to enter our 50th anniversary, and the reason we're doing this exhibition in part is because we're completely renovating the building now. We've done the center core renovation. We closed for a couple of years. We're reopening. Now we've got our west wing closed, a third of the museum, and it will reopen in 2015 with our exhibition, and then other exhibitions will open in 2016 on the second and third floors. And our new notion is to organize around some really key ideas that we think help define Americans as Americans. What really makes America the nation that it is? So the first floor of the exhibition will be about, and let me just show you a little bit of the inside. This is the interior of the museum with the new design. And you can see we've opened it up to bring natural light in there. And behind that, what we call the abstract flag is one of our real treasures, the flag that flew at Fort McHenry and inspired our national anthem. So maybe it'll be that new flag that I'm sure, seriously, that's where we are. So here's the first floor of our new renovation. And this is a floor about business, discovery, innovation, and creativity. And those are the ideas that we're trying to develop. So it's not just a part of a social sector, but really the ideas that shape us. The second floor will be about democracy and immigration, the peopling of America and political freedom. And the third floor will be about American culture and how it develops out of capitalism and democracy and our immigrant culture. So here's where we are. We have about 8,500 square feet, and you're going to ask me how many square meters that is, and I'm not entirely sure. We have a gallery of numismatic history right next door to that. Across the way we have a hall of invention that relates to that. The first exhibit there will be Places of Invention that will look at place-based history and how it shapes an innovative culture. We have a conference center and a place for young kids and a learning center there. Something called the Object Project, where we can help people learn through experiencing material culture, and a performance plaza or demonstration stage where we have live performances that help augment what we're telling in our exhibitions. So all those subjects fit together and relate to each other to give a dynamic presentation, not only the exhibition format, but with live performances and demonstrations and different activities. So what's American Enterprise going to be all about? The overall goal is to help our visitors understand how American business has affected both the nation's history and their own lives. Now that seems like a simple statement, but it's really important to unpack that into the two parts. If you don't help people understand how this story affects their own life, you're going to lose them at about a quarter of the way through. Because then it's about those people who lived long ago, and why should I care? But if it's about me and my life and who I am, and I see the connection between that, then you can begin helping your audience understand why this story is relevant to them. And the key message is to understand these factors: opportunity, innovation, competition, and the common good, which we think is the unpacking of what we think is one of the fundamental dynamics of American history, and your history too, which is a creative tension between capitalism and democracy. And so that really plays, we often say, individual opportunity and common good at the individual level, capitalism and democracy at the national level. But these other factors are important too. Opportunity. That's why people come. That's why they get involved in business. That's what they're looking for. Innovation. That's what drives the economy. That's what brings change about. Competition sorts it out. But if there's no concern with the common good, then the society just drives wealth or just drives the interests of special interest groups. So it's the democracy and capitalism tension that brings that common good factor to shape how business interacts. We were talking at lunch the fact that businessmen often say, well, you know, government is just regulation and it's not important, but you let a business get in trouble, and the first thing that they're looking for is common good. You take the Constitution of the United States, one of the things that was built into the Constitution was protection of intellectual property. Who can protect that? That's common good. That's doing something that supports all businesses. So that tension, it changes all the time, but it is a key tension to who we are. Now, we're not trying to cover all the sectors of American business. Some of those are covered elsewhere in our museum, but we picked these 5 that we're touching on: information and technology and communications, retail and service, finance, manufacture, and agriculture. And they all increasingly interrelate. And we'll look at some of the ways how as we go through. Now this is the structure that we're doing in the exhibition. We have an entrance. We're telling the story of marketing out front. I mean, if you want to advertise business history, why don't you use what they use, right? I mean, advertising, people put incredible creativity to try to explain their products and their interests to their customers. So we will use the history of advertising and advertising selections across time to help attract people and communicate our story. The middle of the story is a chronological development through 4 different eras: what we call the merchant era, the corporate era, the consumer era, and the global era. We were talking a little bit about economic theory this morning. Many of you are familiar with the economic theory of Joseph Schumpeter, who talks about capitalism as being a phase of creative destruction. That one era goes to another because there's innovation that leads to change, there's competition. If you can't continue to innovate and compete, you get replaced. And government and other social things soften the blow. But we see that that kind of force happened in American history that drove the merchant era to the corporate era, that drove the corporate era to the consumer era, that drove the consumer era to the global era. So that's sort of a part of the economic theory that we see underneath the exhibition. And let's explore this in some greater detail. So I should tell you we're about 60% through our planning. So what you're seeing in this presentation are working drawings, working ideas. Many of them will change before you get there. But the notion is that as you go into the exhibition, you'll have an interactive wall here. And you can see the marketing moments, we call them, over here, and we'll see a little bit more about that. But the notion is you come up to that wall, and it's moving, it's changing all the time. Things are floating by, mostly products, and you touch a product, and all of a sudden it comes alive. And coming out of it is somebody related to its production, or its innovation, and somebody related to its consumption. So let's say it's a Barbie doll. You have Ruth Handler and the story of Barbie and how she came up. You get that representation, and then you have a little girl. And then you have words that come about innovation or competition or profit. So you immediately get the notion that this exhibition is lively, it's interesting, it's about people, it's about ideas, it's about products and their interrelation. And it's fun. And it's something to explore. And by the way, every once in a while, something will come by you, touch it, it goes kaboom! So you get Betamax or something like that, and all of a sudden, because there are failures in business as well. And so that'll be fun and surprising and interesting. So we want to engage people, but we know theoretically that people come to exhibitions really because they have three different interests. They're interested in ideas, or objects, or people. So we're telling them at the beginning, it's about all three of those. Now on the right of that, you see marketing moments, and this is a notion that there's two different faces, one that faces outside and one that faces inside. And let's look at a little bit more mature drawing. Now this is a most recent drawing of the outward-facing wall. And we start with a newspaper ad, and we start going to the ads in the late 19th century when you started having color graphics and lithographs and things like that. And we're down below, part of the creativity was in the imaging and the branding, and part of the creativity is in the words. So we're going to have a lot of familiar phrases, snap, crackle, pop, the pause that refreshes, good, things that, you never can get out of your brain no matter how hard you try. So they're telling the story of how business is part of our life, invades our life. It changes who we are, it changes our nation. And we'll tell that story on the outside in this sort of fun way. Some of the panels will be interactive and we'll be changing. We'll have 10 or 20 different images, and some of them will be static. And on the inside, we unpack that story more fully. So we give you a full chronology, we tell you some of the people, there's some labeling, some interpretation that tells that story much more deeply. But has some of the same notion that marketing, this relationship between producers and consumers through marketing and advertising, is a big part of the business history story. Now each of our four sections has a structure. And we have in the center what we call our marketplace. And again, the marketplace is a key notion for us because that's where producers and consumers come together. We have on each of the others what we call atmospheric walls, which set the context. Then we have what we call arcades that tell individual stories. So we tell the feature stories in the center of the marketplace, individual stories on the side, and set the context with these walls. And we'll talk more about these in just a minute. We have one part that goes into the merchant section, which just sets the context for the whole thing. This is an interplay between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. If you know much American history, you'll know that when we split from the British through our independence, we often learned that the issue was taxes. But in fact, the real issue that underlay that was who was going to get the profits from the business development in America after the French were gone, the French and Indian War, we won that war, and the British are saying, we want more profit from that American set of colonies. And the Americans resisted. The taxes were just a presenting cause. Now, when we win the revolution, and George Washington's president, he nominates the two smartest people he knew to be his lead advisors. One of them is Thomas Jefferson, who becomes his Secretary of State, and the other is Alexander Hamilton, who becomes his Secretary of the Treasury. And they fundamentally disagree about the economic future of the United States. So they set the context. We've been disagreeing amongst ourselves ever since. And so we're telling the story that was there in the beginning. Jefferson wanted the United States to develop as an agricultural nation. He was dependent on the yeoman farmer who would have his independent farm, and the United States should focus on its natural resources and raw materials and build its economy that way. Alexander Hamilton believed that we should have a strong government that would support manufacturers, that we should compete with Britain across the whole economic spectrum. We should develop manufacturing right away and trade around the world, but with a very strong government. And so this was really the beginning of political parties in the United States, because Jefferson went along to form his political party of the Anti-Federalists, and Hamilton formed his political party of the Federalists. He probably would have been an early president if he hadn't died in a duel that he fought. But we're illustrating that, and by the way, right in the middle we have an early American dollar. Now, interestingly enough, on American money in this period, it does not have the picture of George Washington on the American dollar. George Washington, many people thought he should appear on the dollar, but he thought that was what a monarchy did. This was a nation that was devoted to freedom, and we put the symbol of liberty on our money. The symbol of liberty was on American money throughout the 19th century. We only put dead presidents on the money beginning of the 20th century. But what's interesting is we decided to use images of Jefferson and Hamilton on the money to sort of set this up as a kind of fun thing to do. Now, Jefferson's on the $2 bill, Hamilton's on the $20 bill, so I don't know who got the best of that. But there you go, that's setting up in the founding era a dramatic presentation about two founders and this debate of the economy and how it shapes the nation. And we hope that will engage our visitors. Now, going back to our first phase, really, which is the merchant era, we're telling stories in the marketplace about some key objects. And I won't go through all of them, but this is the atmospheric wall that sets it up. Traditionally in museums, when you wanted to take you back to a different era and put you in a different time period, we created a period setting. We created, put the architecture there, the lighting, the colors, and all that kind of thing. We really can't do that anymore because those settings tended to be middle-class white settings, and there are a lot of different kinds of people and a lot of different kinds of environments, and so we want to give a greater variety. So we don't know whether it's going to work or not, but what we're going to do is have a changing set of images that provide that context and say there were many different contexts in early America. Look at some of them, and occasionally we'll have factoids in there that say, who was the richest man in America in this period? Well, it was John Jacob Astor. And how did he make all this money? From beavers. Seriously, it's the beaver trade that drives wealth in early America, and that's going to be a surprise to many of our visitors, and hopefully it's going to engage them and interest them. So we'll be doing that factoid and image change. Now in the marketplace, a mixture of stories, this is one of the key stories. This is the Red River cart. This is the oldest wheeled vehicle that we have in the Museum of American History. Looks like an ordinary wagon. It was used in Minnesota on the frontier in this period by Indians, Metis women, who were engaged in the fur trade. Now what were they trying to do? They were trying to break the monopoly of the British and the Hudson Bay Company. They were using this, they were trading, they were trying to trade with people all around, and they had a very flexible vehicle. This Red River cart, you could take the wheels off, you could float it down a river, and the women were driving the trade rather than men. So here we are telling a women's story, a Native American story, a business story, with a real artifact from this early period, in ways that are going to surprise you and hopefully interest you, and saying, boy, who knew about that in our history? And this is just some of the things. We'll have a stuffed beaver in there. We'll have other trade objects, things that were traded for the beaver with the Indians and things like that. So this is just an example of where we are trying to make this story work. And one that I don't have illustrated that's also a key story in this section is the story of slavery. Slavery is a huge part of American history in this era, particularly this merchant era going up to 1860. This is a long time frame. It goes from 1770 to 1850s. And the way we've decided to do that, because we have such limited space, is to tell the story of the slave trade itself, that is the trade of human beings. Because we think that probably the most horrible thing about the slave trade is that people became objects. They became capital. They were the largest investment in the southern United States in that time, far exceeding the investment in the north in machinery. But don't kid yourself that this was only a southern issue. People in the north were investing in the slave trade. Many of them sold insurance on the slave trade. They were involved in shipment of slaves and moving the slaves internally. So it's a big business capital investment. And we will tell that story too with the splitting up of a family, as often happened when slaves were broken apart and sold as if to get the highest price. Whether you could sell them as a family to get a price, that was great. If you had to break them apart to make more money, you tended to do that. So that's another story in this section that I don't have illustrated, but it indicates they were trying to tell positive, negative, interesting, dynamic stories that get you engaged in what you're doing. So I've shown you the atmospheric wall in the marketplace. This is what we're doing in the arcades. And this will be just a sampling of interesting, provocative stories of this time period. So one of them, to try to get people interested, is what did people drink in the colonies? So we're showing chocolate or tea. We have a little interactive here where we're going to let you figure out, you get to choose somebody that you want to drink something with, and you get to choose to drink and find out a little bit more about that. So you can choose chocolate or tea or water or whiskey. And one of the things you learn if you take water is people didn't drink much water because it was risky. And another thing that we learned in doing the research is there was a real market in what was the 18th century version of bottled water. It was called tea water. If you wanted water for your tea and you were wealthy enough, you didn't go down and get it from the river or down in the well in the town. You would buy it from somebody that lived outside of town on a farm. They put it in because why? Because it was less risky. So there was a real market in filling up barrels with water and selling it to wealthy people in towns for their tea. So you'll learn that here. But you'll also see the material culture of tea. We're telling the story of artisans to industry. That is, this is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in America. There were many people that resisted that. There were artisans that wanted to do the whole job. They didn't want to have division of labor. So we tell shoes and textiles are our two examples. We tell the story of the gold rush and grabbing land. This is really an interesting story of how there was a systematic effort to create treaties with Indian tribes, move them west, and distribute that land to white Americans. And we'll be showing that. That's money and debt. It's really a critical story to tell the story of money and credit. We tend to think that the 19th century was really a time of simplicity. I mean, we live in this complicated era with credit cards and debit cards. Oh my gosh, it's so complicated. Back then, it was a simple life and pastoral. Don't kid yourself. There are many kinds of money. After the Revolution, America didn't have national money. We had issued continental money for the Revolution, and it completely devalued, and nobody, I mean nobody trusted the government to issue paper money. So who was issuing money? States, local banks. There were dozens and dozens of currencies floating in America. They were all valued differently next to each other. And we're going to show some because we've got a great collection of them. So we're going to help people unpack the meaning of money in that time period and relate it to credit and debt and land speculation in that time period. We're also going to tell the story of extending the day. Here's innovation. One of the things that's big is how do you extend the day by new forms of lighting? The whale trade, whale oil, that's candles and so on, different ways that people are trying to figure out how to make the workday longer, how they could use the night more effectively, particularly for business. So that's a sampling of this first era, this era of the 1770s to the 1850s that we're focusing on. Just to give you a sample and a contrasting set of stories for the next era, which is we're calling the corporate era, the 1860s to the 1930s. Now, one of the things that I hope you've noticed is we have not periodized around wars. Most of the history that we're taught, at least in America, is periodized around wars. We could have done that. We had long debates. How do we periodize this history? We decided to break it around the wars and let the wars be covered in a minor way in there, but our story was primarily not about that. So we're starting this story in the 1860s, but not featuring the Civil War as a major effort. And we're seeing this as a time of the growth of big business in America. It obviously starts with the canals and later the railroads, but it moves into other forms of technology. One of the major examples that we're using is the development of the telephone that, of course, came out of the telegraph. The telegraph becomes commercial in the United States in the 1840s and becomes international in the 1850s. It provides the foundation for the first growth of the communications industry. Bell develops his telephone and debuts it at the Centennial in 1876, and pretty soon we've got a huge communications business in America. So we're going to tell that story as one of our marketplace stories here. And what we're going to use as a device, well, here's our atmospheric wall. And you can see in this era we have two static images and one changing image. We want to show the different look and feel of the corporate era, big buildings, larger cities, large farms with technology on them. They're not small merchant farms, large capital investment. And again, we're using our factoids. So we decided in this section, instead of using something like the Red River Cart and the slaves being traded, we're going to use models of big buildings. And what does corporate America look like? It looks like buildings and farms. So we have this big tractor, which was the Fordson tractor, and this is a time when tractors are just being introduced. Tractors only really become big in American agriculture after World War II. They're starting to be introduced before that, but they're specialties. Most people are still using horse-drawn technology. So underneath the tractor, we'll have a model of two farms, one that has horse-drawn technology and one that has a model of a tractor, but you'll see a real tractor. And around that, we'll have models of other institutions, the AT&T headquarters building in New York that's driving that industry. We'll talk about the organization of business that's required when you have a major industry that stretches across miles and miles. So what switching technology looks like, what the accounting department looks like, that all of a sudden you have hundreds of people, mostly women, at desks with calculating machines, typewriters and things like that. And we'll show Marshall Fields in Chicago, because this is a time when American productivity has led to the development of productivity and new products, and they have to be sold. And one of the innovations that comes to help sell these products to Americans, but the department store, the palace of consumption. And there's no greater palace of consumption than Marshall Fields in Chicago. So we'll show a cutaway model of that, and the great organ in the middle, and what those desks look like, and get a sense of what that business is like. And here, I won't go through all these, but these are a sample of some of the stories that we're telling. Power and productivity, that's both steam and electricity, trust and monopolies. One of the things we're doing is telling the story of bootlegging. Now here's really an interesting story of how government was trying to do something good. This was a common good story. Prohibition came to America because people were concerned about the drunkenness and the disorderly conduct, mostly of men in cities and elsewhere. And so some well-meaning citizens pushed through a law to outlaw liquor in America. Well, it didn't work. And so there was immediately a black market that just went crazy in America. We see this in other countries. There's often a black economy when this goes awry. So we'll tell both sides of that story. And of course, that the Prohibition Amendment to the Constitution was repealed. But the story of how a business developed underneath that interplay between society and their government, and how people tried to shape the lives of others, we think is an important part of the story. Another other common good story is the story of the Depression and the New Deal that comes along as government tries to intervene to soften the blows of the Depression. It's really the beginning of big government as we know it today in the United States. So that gets back to our capitalism and democracy and how they interrelate in our economy. So the consumer era, and I'm not going to go into the same level of detail because of time constraints, but this is the era when we see beginning in 1940, but really growing after World War II, that it's not good enough just to prepare your automobiles and sell them if they're black. You have to customize your products for consumer demand. The incredible amount of money and wealth in the United States after World War II that manufacturers are responding to and businesses responding to. So we're looking at things like the refrigerator and the home, and where the woman becomes a prime consumer and buying all kinds of products. We're looking at television as another type of product, really existed before World War II, gets big after World War II, and becomes dominant in our society. Also looking in this section about the role of men and women coming into business. The gray flannel suit. This is a time of a lot of concern about business and the role of women. Are they going to go back into the home after World War II? Are they going to come into the office? What's the tension that goes on? We're looking at the development of market segmentation. This is a time when the African American market becomes a major market for business. They start targeting not different markets with their advertising, trying to reach out with different consumers. And the role of the marketing department is as important as production and innovation in business development in America. So again, shifting quickly to the final era, we're looking at globalization as a major theme here. Now, globalization had existed in America since the beginning. I mean, we were a colony, so we were always involved in the global trade. But in this period, as you know from your history, globalization takes on a whole different flavor. It may be a majority of the business of American business is often global, and the spread of American products around the world. So we're looking at a variety of different case studies that look at how globalization works. So this is one of the symbols of McDonald's in Japanese. I mean, everybody's seen this symbol. Branding takes on a global role. The issue of whether it's the same product or some slightly different product, but the brand is the same. And another great symbol is the Google server. Now, we just borrowed this from Google, and I don't know how many of you know that really fascinating story of two college students decided that the key to making the internet work was search. And if they could deal with search, then they could really make a lot of money. So Paige and Bryn in their Stanford dorm room came up with a company. In their first iteration of the company, they had to build a lot of servers because they downloaded the whole internet. And then they had to figure out how to do searches on it. Well, they couldn't afford the technology. So how could they afford enough servers to download the whole internet and search across it? They had to build their own servers. So what they did, this is an example, this is one of the server racks. They put 30 racks here, and each of them's got a PC. They bought a bunch of used PCs. They'd get them from anywhere. They'd get them used, they'd get broken ones, and wire them together and try to fix them. But they developed in such a way that if one of those PCs went bad, because a lot of them went bad, the software was fault tolerant enough, it would just map around it, just ignore it. They'd go back and replace it later. And that fault tolerance, if you talk to people at Google today, they still don't put all their money in hardware. They put a lot of their money in software and try to work around failures in hardware. So this is really one of those things that, you know, you look at it and you say, these guys became some of the richest guys in the world doing something like this. And it's just, you know, it's one of those things. It's an object that just looks exactly the way you want it to look, right? It's a kludgy innovation object and a bunch of wires and used parts and two guys, and they had an idea and they're college students. I mean, it's an inspiring story that the artifact really helps tell the story. So we really love the Google server. In the middle of that section, we're going to have a little theatrical presentation of where we're projecting down from the ceiling on what looks like a globe on the floor, where you can move around the globe and go to different places and see globalization in action. So that gives you a quick walkthrough of what we expect to happen in the 4 chronological sections. But one of the things that's really important to you, I know, with your Business Hall of Fame is how do you tell biographical stories? Now, biography, the story of people, is really important to our story because, again, our story is about objects and ideas and about people. So across the whole back of the exhibition, we're going to have dozens and dozens of people that whom you can meet. And these will be entrepreneurs, there'll be businessmen, big businessmen, businesswomen, small, working in a variety of different ways. So you'll see their stories and be able to read about them. And we're trying to get really fascinating pictures. Sometimes we'll take the pictures of them when they're young. For example, the picture of Bill Gates and Paul Allen that we're going to use is not the picture of Bill Gates, the chairman of Microsoft. It's going to be the picture of Bill Gates and Paul Allen when they created Trafo data in Seattle before anybody ever heard of Microsoft, because they were doing business when they were in high school. And so we want to tell that as an inspirational story as a surprise. But another thing we're going to try there is build into the wall a lot of reveals. So the pull drawers or flip-ups or things you can look through. And it might be that you'll see the picture of a product and look through the peephole and see the person. Or sometimes there'll be a lift-up. For example, one of the things we do is telling the story of a counterfeiter. And we'll see the real bill and then slide it and see the counterfeit bill. We're going to tell the story of Mary Kay, but you have to look through a little peephole to see the cosmetics that she developed. So again, we're trying to make this story interesting, a story of people with ideas at different phases in their development. And the final section of our exhibition will be what we call the exchange. We call it that because we have a piece of a stock booth that was on the floor in New York in 1929 when the market crashed. And we're going to have a dramatic show that's going to make your show just look like old hat. That tells the story of the fall of the stock market and looks at that time that's really a fundamental change. And in between shows, it'll show economic trends over time. And then around it will be a number of interactive activities that are not time-based, but just sort of different ideas. One of them that I don't have illustrated here that we're developing is for really young people. And there'll be 2 crank wheels, and you'll sit next to each other. And all of a sudden, you'll say, compete, and they have to compete. And at a certain point, it'll change and say, cooperate, and they have to cooperate. And if they don't learn how to compete and cooperate, they're going to fail. And that's really sort of a basic message. Sometimes in business, you have to compete. Sometimes in business, you have to cooperate. You know, it's not all about competition. And so it's just, we're trying to find different activities that illustrate that. Another one that we're doing is what we call the farming challenge. We're going to create what looks like a cab of one of these big tractors. If you go into tractors today, you know, they don't look like the tractors of yesterday. They've all got GPS. They've got a communication screen. They've got internet. People have their iPhones. So we'll give you what we call a farming challenge. You'll be on the farm. You're going through. All of a sudden, you have to make a decision about farming. And the first decision will be something that's really related to agriculture. Okay, let's say that you know that the rain is going to be really protected, much heavier rain. Are you still going to plant today or not? Or are you going to wait? You know, and then the next decision will be about a business decision. Okay, you've got the crop from last year. The market just fell out of wheat on the Chicago Exchange. Are you going to go ahead and sell, or are you going to hold on to that wheat for another month? Now, of course, you've got to pay to hold on to it. And the basic message is farming is not just worrying about stuff in the field, it's business. And it's really high-tech business in today's world. So we'll give you that experience and let you make a couple of decisions and see if you succeed or fail. We'll have another set of interactives. And just one other example is one we call tough business decisions. We're going to give you real case studies and give you a setup problem and ask you what would you have done in this situation, and then tell you what they really did at the time. So again, showing you that business decisions require tough thinking and sometimes risk-taking, and sometimes you're right and sometimes you're wrong. Okay, so an exhibition like this is a huge investment on this part of the Smithsonian. We have about 5 million people a year that come through our museum. We hope to attract a substantial number of them to this exhibition. We're going to get one chance to do it. This exhibition in some form will be around for a couple of decades. We really hope we get it right. So we love advice from people like you to help us think it through. But an exhibition is just the starting point. In addition to the exhibition, I was talking about this a little bit later, we have historic theater that goes out, hands-on learning, some of that's live in the exhibition, some of it's on the floor. There's continuing education, there's conferences, there's curriculum material that will go out to schools. It's the starting point of a nexus of activities and learning materials that go out to a wide variety of people. We've already started our website. Usually we do the exhibition and then we do the website. We decided in this case we wanted to learn in public. So you can go out now and look at americanenterprise.si.edu and see many of these ideas there and see different ideas we're trying to explore and share with people. We're doing some crowdsourcing, trying some new things. So we're telling stories of, again, that we try out. If the story's a real winner online, people are really looking at it, we may include an exhibit. If it's kind of ho-hum, we may leave it out. We have pawn balls. One of the stories that we're telling along the biography wall is the story of a pawnbroker. We think people don't know much really about pawning, unless they pawn stuff a lot, but they hear about it, so we want to tell that story. We're going to have objects, and we tell different object stories that we're working on. And right now we're involved in an activity of crowdsourcing stories about American agriculture. Now our collection is very strong in American agriculture up to about the 1960s. Since then we're kind of weak, both in technology and stories. So we decided on National Agriculture Day this year, we would start a crowdsourcing activity where we'd ask people to share their stories with us about being on the farm and farm life. And so that's active now. People are sharing their stories. We even got the Secretary of the Smithsonian to share his story. So we're bringing that in and putting it on the web now. We'll be using some of that in the exhibition, but this itself is self-supporting because we have 5 million people that come to the museum. We have 14 million people that regularly look at our website. So this is the way to reach audiences around the nation and around the world with our stories. And again, with our objects, we're going to have a lot of wonderful objects in American Enterprise, but we never have more than 5% of the objects we hold on display. So we have to share those electronically if we're going to share them at all. So our goal is to get a lot more objects online with stories that we can share with people around the nation and around the world. So what's the point? Why are we doing all this? Are we going to succeed? What will success look like? You know, again, going back to our fundamental goal, our goal is to help people recognize the role of business and innovation in international history. We don't think, we've said it today, we don't think that that's strong enough yet. We want them to understand how financial and business history affects social change and their own lives. If they're young people, we hope that they will think that, you know, a career in business, being an innovator, may be as exciting as being a rock star or a football player. You know, we've got to make this exciting. We've got to make it engaging. We hope they will appreciate the stories of people, the objects, and the stories from a brand new perspective. We talked this morning about how so much about what you read about business in the papers today is usually about a scandal or something that went wrong or somebody died because they took a medicine that didn't work. They don't talk much about the fact that millions of people are being saved. It's not that we're trying to tell a sugar-coated story. I hope you saw that in what we're telling. It's a balanced story, but it's an exciting story. We want to help people see from a new perspective. Our goal is not to give them all the answers or even give them the full floor of American history, but to engage their curiosity, to give them an environment for learning that says, I want to know more about that. Gosh, I saw something about pawnbroking in the Smithsonian. I didn't know, Maybe they'll look it up on their handheld while in the museum, or maybe they'll go home and want to learn more. And finally, we really want to inspire a new generation of people who will be our business leaders of tomorrow with this exhibition. So that's our goal. And those are some of the ideas that we're trying to use to communicate about business history, and at least as a first attempt at trying to solve some of the problems that we've been talking about in this conference. Thank you.
Well, David, that was absolutely marvellous. Totally provocative. And we've only got 5 minutes before we go, and I'll invite
Should have
David
spoken for 5 more minutes.
to join us in our next session. But does anybody want to pose any? Yes, please, straight away.
I'm just really interested to know the people you're getting to the agricultural stories. What are the standards you're asking them
To judge to offer.
I'm just really interested to know the people you're asking to
Right.
contribute the stories. What are the technical things they have to do? What are the standards?
It's pretty open in terms of getting. Now, we don't post every story that comes in. I mean, there is a filtering mechanism. We have to review it. We may edit it a little bit. We don't promise that we're going to post it. So if somebody writes something that's really off the wall or profane or something like that, it doesn't automatically go up. But the goal is to help people. I mean, we have some background information about the kind of things that we're looking for, and they're the themes of the exhibition about competition and farm life and that kind of thing. So you should look at some of the stories that have been sampled.
Sorry, what I mean is, are they filming themselves on a phone with the camera, with a video camera?
They can submit video, but mostly it's stills, and we're looking for a lot of stills. And mostly it's stills and text. No, I thought they'd just come back on. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
You use a lot of objects in your exhibition. I mean, that's sorry.
Pardon me?
You use a lot of objects.
Yes.
For your
Right.
exhibition. My question is, how would you link objects to everyday life? I mean, business everyday life, and what kind of methodological issues or business historian to use material culture methodology?
Well, at the Smithsonian, material culture is our stock in trade. We like to think that we tell the real story with the real stuff. And so we're always anxious to have original, authentic objects to tell our story. So the real winning object is the one that is historically important, was related to a major event, and was tied to a major person. One that I'm working on now, we have an Apple I computer that we borrowed, and the guy that we borrowed it from now wants to sell it to us, but he wants to sell it to us for about $700,000, which is what they're. And so we were talking to one of our advisors in the business community. He said, "Why don't you get Steve Wozniak's?" I said, "I don't have Steve Wozniak's email." So he gave me Steve Wozniak's email, contacted him, he said, "Yeah, we'll take an email from the Smithsonian." So we're trying to negotiate that one. But if we could get that, that's one you would want to go see, right? You want to see Steve Wozniak's Apple I. If you can get an object like that, and you look at it, it meets all your criteria. I mean, it's historically important to business. It can be studied from many different perspectives, and it sets the framework for looking at how the computer industry and computer technology changed the world. Yeah.
My question might be, how far do you think the success of America, is due to the Protestant work ethic? Now this came up recently on a film of China, which of course at the moment is undergoing great economic success. And in that film, the speaker, who was a professor from England,
Neil
made a
Ferguson.
comparison between North America and South America. And it said that the success of North America was due to the Protestant work ethic.
I think it's almost impossible to reduce a story as complex as the economic history of the United States to anything as simple as that. So unquestionably, religious values, not just Protestant, but many different kind of religious values, were a major factor in bringing certain kinds of people to the United States. But the business, the political climate in the country, the natural resources that were readily available there, the fact that the Europeans brought diseases with them that the Native Americans were not immune to, and so many Native Americans just died because of smallpox or things like that. So the notion of really focusing on a one cause, I think, and overdoing it, belies the complexity of a story like how business developed in America. Had the United States lost the American Revolution, which it easily could have done, things would have been very different.
That's
So-
Neil Ferguson's killer apps, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's those. I think he's got about 7.
Yeah,
It's a series, his last series, about why the successful features or something of the Western model, and I think it's 7 killer apps or something or other.
Yeah.
It was on SBS. I don't know how many of you saw it, but I did. Who somebody else had that? We might have room for one more before we go to somebody. Oh, we didn't. No, all right. We'll pause. Oh, sorry, someone did say. Yeah.
Oh, well, I just think, the clarity of the curatorial intent of such a huge exhibition of democracy meets capitalism, I think that's a really big, compelling story that these other, and how long did it take for you to get to that?
To think that through.
Think that through, who helped who, when was the aha moment? Or
This may not be one of those stories that you're not supposed to really tell.
Yeah.
This exhibition has been in development a long time, and we've had different views, but it really has been a constant discussion and looking at different issues. But unquestionably, as curators and people that are interested in public history, we're constantly looking for ways to crystallize or simplify a story. Not to hide the complexities we were just talking about, but at least if you get that, I think a lot of people just never thought about that maybe the two defining ideologies of America in many respects are democracy and capitalism. What do they have to do with each other? And if we can just get people to think about that, whether they agree with us or not, we've done a service. So that and the big ideas of innovation, opportunity, innovation, competition, and common good, those are ideas that should be swimming around our head. One of the things that our new director has brought is we need to focus on ideas and driving ideas.
Can we borrow him,
mission.
please?
So it's not about business. It's not about politics. It's about ideas that infuse those aspects of our society with creativity and with drive and with meaning.
Wonderful. Look, we're going to just have 15 minutes break, so could you be back here at 2:50, please, and we'll go to our last. Well, I really think a big clap. Thank you for.